It was so cold that even the wind sounded like it was trying to hide. You wouldn't hear birds, you wouldn't hear laughter, just the slow crunch of feet through frozen mud, and the breathing of people who knew that stopping meant death. Somewhere around what we now call southern Europe, tucked deep in a forest that hadn't seen green in years, there was a small tribe. No name written, no flag, no record. But somehow, they made it. They weren't the strongest, they didn't have the biggest weapons or the warmest caves. In fact, by most standards, they shouldn't have survived at all. But they had something else, something strange, something that even now scientists still argue about. They had fire, yes, but more than that, they had a way of working together that almost didn't feel human. It felt more like instinct, like every single one of them would die for the other without even thinking. No leaders, no orders, just survival, shared and silent. At night, the cold crept through the animal hides they wrapped around their bodies. Parents would press their children close, not to warn them, but just to keep them alive until morning. Every breath showed in the air like smoke signals to the darkness outside. Food was nearly impossible to find. The animals had moved south, the rivers had frozen over, and the plants were brittle with frost. But this tribe, they didn't hunt like others. They didn't wait for prey to pass. They set traps, created paths, funneled animals using snowdrifts and wind scent. It was smart. Too smart for people who were supposed to be primitive. And when one person caught something, even a small rabbit, no one ate alone. They say a tribe is only as strong as the bond between its weakest members. If that's true, then this one had something most others didn't. There were no castaways, no one left behind. If someone was too weak to walk, they were carried. Not because of rules, not because of laws, because in this tribe, survival was not a personal mission. It was a shared one. But they weren't safe. Not even close. Because something was following them, somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, across the white plains, were others, hungry, desperate, angry, not animals, not quite human either. A different group, one that had learned to kill other tribes for food. The survivors had no idea how close they were to being hunted. The morning didn't come with light. It came with sound, a crack deep in the woods. Then silence again. Every ear in the camp turned toward the trees. But no one moved. Not yet. This tribe had survived because they knew when to wait. They didn't rush out with weapons. They listened. They looked at the snow, the footprints it left, the shapes in the fog. It wasn't an animal. That was clear. The steps were careful. Too careful. Like whoever was out there didn't want to be heard. Or seen. And that meant something dangerous. The elders didn't speak. They just nodded to one another and slowly began to bury the fire. They spread ash over it with bare hands, quiet as ghosts. The children were pulled close and wrapped tighter. They knew this drill. They had done it before. They weren't warriors. They didn't want to fight. Not because they were afraid, but because they knew fighting meant losing. Losing time, losing blood, losing people. Instead they had something else, a kind of map in their minds. Not drawn on stone, but passed through stories and whispers, a secret path in the woods, one that animals avoided, one even the snow seemed to forget. That's where they went. One by one, they disappeared into the trees. No noise, no panic, just silence, like snow falling on snow. By the time the hunters reached the camp, there was nothing left. No fire, no meat, no footprints, only ash and a stillness that felt wrong. But those hunters weren't the only danger. Winter was changing. The old ice was beginning to crack in places it never had. The snow wasn't falling the way it used to. Sometimes the wind carried strange smells, of ash, of rot, of something not quite dead. The tribe moved again, heading further north than they had ever gone. It made no sense. Everything told them to go south, to find warmth. But they trusted something else. Something older than instinct. It was like the earth itself was whispering to them. They followed the trees, not the sun. They listened to the animals, the way birds vanished, the way wolves stopped howling. That's how they stayed ahead of everything else. One night they found a cave. Not just any cave. This one was warm, not from fire, from deep within the earth. The walls dripped with heat. It was a place no one had ever seen before, and for the first time in weeks they slept without shaking. The children laughed, the elders cried, and no one knew if they would ever leave that cave again. But for that moment, in that tiny pocket of warmth buried inside the coldest time in human history, they had survived. They were still alive, and something about that mattered more than anything else. No one knew how long they stayed inside that cave. Time didn't pass the way it used to. The outside world was just a noise, wind howling, ice shifting, animals moving far beyond reach. But inside, it was quiet. The kind of quiet you feel more than hear. At first, they were afraid to make fire, afraid it would draw eyes they couldn't see, so they used the earth's warmth instead. They learned to sleep close to the hot stone, to dry their hides against the walls, to eat in near darkness. And something strange began to happen. They got stronger. The children stopped coughing. The elders began to move without groaning. The hunters started sharpening their weapons again, not out of fear, but out of preparation. Something was returning to them, not just strength, but memory. They started telling stories again, the kind of stories that hadn't been spoken since the last warm season. Tales about where they came from, who their grandparents were, what stars meant, what death really was. They painted on the walls, slowly, carefully, like they were trying to remember something too big for words. Shapes of animals, of spirits, of people dancing around fire that didn't burn. No one taught them to do this. It came from inside, as if memory was carried not in minds, but in hands. And then they heard it again. A noise from outside, not cracking ice this time, not wind, voices, not their own. There were others near the cave, not the hunters, not beasts, something in between. People maybe, but not like them. These others didn't speak their language. They didn't leave tracks. They just appeared, like ghosts with teeth. The tribe didn't wait. They knew what happened to those who waited. They packed everything: meat, tools, dried hides, even their paints. They left the cave behind. Every child carried. Every elder helped. Every eye watching the trees. But one boy stayed behind for a moment. He looked at the last painting on the wall, a figure holding fire, surrounded by animals and stars. And he touched it, not with fear, but with understanding, like he knew what it meant. Then he turned and followed the others into the snow. Behind him, the cave grew silent again. The walls still warm, the drawings still waiting for someone else to find them, thousands of years later. They walked for days, maybe weeks. Time didn't matter anymore, only distance and silence. The snow came harder now, not soft like before, but heavy. Thick flakes that felt like ash falling in waves, burying their footprints behind them. Food was low again, the small animals were gone. The rivers, once frozen, had turned into deep cracks. Some of them steamed, some of them swallowed sound. No one wanted to walk too close. They began seeing strange things. Trees torn from the roots, dead animals without marks, frozen mid-run. The earth was shifting beneath them, and something deep inside it was waking up. One night they found a bird, just one. Its wings were white, almost glowing. It didn't fly, it didn't run, it just stood there looking at them. The elder said it was a sign, but he didn't say of what. So they followed the bird. It moved slow, stopping often. Sometimes it vanished but always reappeared, just ahead like it was waiting. The tribe moved behind it like a shadow, and then, without warning, the bird led them to something impossible. A valley. Warm, alive, green. It shouldn't have existed. Everything around it was ice and death, but this one place was different. Trees with leaves, streams that moved, mud, not frost, under their feet. The tribe stood there in silence, afraid to touch it, afraid it would vanish. Then the youngest girl stepped forward. She bent down and picked up something no one had seen in years. A flower. And the spell broke. They ran, they laughed, they wept, they dug their fingers into the earth like it was something holy. They had survived so long without warmth that this moment felt like stepping into a dream. They built shelters, they caught fish, they watched birds nest in branches again. But something still lingered. Not fear, not anymore. It was memory of what they'd seen, what they'd lost, of the cave, the fire, the paintings, of the people who didn't make it. And that's when the oldest among them made a choice. They built a stone circle in the centre of the valley, not for gods, not for power, but for remembering. Each rock placed by hand, each symbol carved by story. It was their way of saying, we were here, we endured, we held each other through the cold, and we made it through. Not because we were stronger, but because we never let go of each other. Years passed, the seasons returned, but they were different now. The cold still came, but it didn't kill. The sun still hid, but it always came back. And the tribe, they stayed. Children who had never known warmth now played in grass. The elders who once feared every footstep now sat in the sun smiling, telling stories that no longer ended in silence. But no one forgot, not what it cost to survive, not the faces they lost, not the nights they went to sleep not knowing if they'd wake up. They kept the stone circle clean. Every mark on it meant something. A birth, a death, a fire shared, a silence broken. They never carved for glory, only for memory. And as new generations came, they told the same stories of the cave, the white bird, the valley that shouldn't exist. And most of all, of how survival didn't come from strength, but from staying human. They said the earth changed because it had to. But people survived because they remembered how to love. And one day, many winters later, a girl, granddaughter of that same child who picked the first flower, found something buried beneath the stones. It was a carving, small, smooth, a figure holding fire. No one knew who made it. Maybe the boy who touched the wall before they left the cave. Maybe someone older, maybe someone forgotten. But the tribe understood what it meant. It wasn't about fire, it wasn't about warmth. It was about carrying something forward, even when everything else tries to pull you back. So they passed the carving hand to hand. Every person in the valley touched it once. Some smiled, some cried, and when they were done, they placed it at the centre of the circle, not to worship it, not to fear it, just to remember. Because they weren't the biggest or the fastest or the loudest, but they were the ones who stayed, the ones who listened when others shouted, the ones who shared when others hoarded, the ones who carried when everyone else gave up. And in the end, that's why they survived the Ice Age. Because they chose not just to live, but to live together. Conclusion. We like to think survival is about strength, about teeth, muscle, speed. But the ones who made it through the coldest, darkest chapter of human history, they weren't the strongest. They were the ones who remembered what it meant to be human. They held hands in the snow. They shared food when there wasn't enough. They carved memories into stone not for power, but so they'd never forget each other. They listened, they waited, they moved together. And because of that, they stayed alive. Not just through the ice, but beyond it. Their stories were passed down in whispers, in marks on walls, in the warmth of firelight and the softness of a child's breath. We may never know their names, but we carry their instincts, their hopes, their choice to care when the world around them had frozen over. They were the ones who survived the Ice Age, and maybe, just maybe, we did too, because of them.